various struggles to stop the genocide. And we are here to fuck the Genocidal National Convention. So, thank you. I don't think anybody should meet anywhere without noting this political moment that 40,000 people have been killed in a genocide, a pre-announced genocide. They said they were going to commit genocide, they are, and the U.S. is fully facilitating it. It wouldn't happen without us. We are so right to be here in opposition. So deeply, deeply grateful. We're going to introduce ourselves quickly, talk a little bit about what's going on this week, and then we're going to welcome in some folks coming in from a distance. So I'm Bill Ayers. I am an organizer, activist, retired professor. Very excited to be with you all today, and very excited, looking forward to the events this week.
Hi, can folks hear me? Hi, everybody. My name's Dixon Romeo. I'm the executive director of Not Me We, a community group in South Shore and adjacent neighborhoods on the south side. And we organize around housing, parents with young people, mutual aid. So very happy to be here with you guys today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kobi, he, him pronouns. I am one of the co-chairs of the Coalition to March on the DNC. I'm also a co-chair of the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. We fight to empower communities to handle, to hold the police accountable, and we also fight to get wrongfully convicted and torture survivors out of prison.
So what I would like us to do, I'd like Dixon and Cole to do, is two quick things. One is to, as best you can, name this political moment. Where are we? And talk a bit about the work you're doing, because you want folks to know about it.
Kobe, go first.
So the question is political moment and how we see it connected to the work that we're doing. So I think that this is, how much time we got? 2 minutes. I think that this moment for me, someone who's like a local community organizer, is really, really enlightening, right? I think that from 2020 until now, obviously we can go back a lot further for all these struggles that we're fighting against, but it's a moment where we're seeing we're seeing like a full cycle of like how radicalization and how folks who are really trying to address the things that they're dealing with, whether it's at a local level like us or international, keep going. Do I keep? Is there like a sound person? Do I keep going? Are we good? And I think that we've seen, radical language and causes that we all care about be co-opted to a degree over the last 4 years or 5 years, from 2020 until now. Everything I think from the justice, housing rights, right, organizing that we do, organizing around the police, has all been kind of started to be co-opted in this moment. And I think that for me, right, and for us, organizing in the eviction capital of the city, right, which is also the neighborhood that's receiving the most influx of new arrivals, right, who are being sent here from Texas, right, like, in a very inhumane way. And it's also a neighborhood like primed to be gentrified, being next to the Obama Center, right? Like there's so many different things, right, that touch a neighborhood. And there are a lot of folks who are coming to the city in this moment to like celebrate or to market the city in a way in which we're gonna talk about as like a world-class city, all the things that it has to offer, while the neighborhoods that don't receive that are getting the bare brunt of that. And those things are connected to the ways in which we are, funding and supporting genocide, right? And there's a connection there, right? Like there are tenants who live in HUD buildings, right, who are not living in proper conditions because that money is being spent and sent to bomb people, right? Like that is the connection that we're trying to drive home with our folks in this moment. And yeah, that's all I'll say about it.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything that Dixon said. And, I think kind of like I think about that Charles Dickens book intro a lot. You know, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, because we're dealing with, we're living in a time where we're seeing this brutality, you know, on this mass scale. We're seeing all this trauma. We're seeing this disregard, you know, from our quote unquote representatives and from the corporations and the rich people who control this society. We're seeing such a disregard for human life, such a hatred for human life, and a complete disregard for the planet that we all have to live in, right? So, you know, we're seeing so much evil, for lack of a more scientific word, on one side, but then we're also seeing what we're seeing in this room, right? We're seeing what we've seen millions of people in Yemen coming out every Friday to stand in solidarity with Palestine. We've seen people marching in South Africa. We've seen the South African government, which I don't know if you can, my accent has gotten a little bit weaker, but I grew up in South Africa, so I'm really proud of what South Africa has done in taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. You know, we're seeing people rising up against their exploitation, against their oppression, in numbers that we haven't really seen before. A lot of people, I've been getting interviews from all these corporate media outlets, and they all want to know, well, how do you compare this moment to 1968, right? Like, there's a lot of superficial stuff that is similar. You know, there's a war, there's a Democratic Party convention happening in Chicago, and there's a large student uprising. But at the same time, we're ahead, you know, of where we were in 1968. You know, we just had in 2020 quantitatively the biggest rebellion that we've had in this country, right? If you had asked me in 2019 or even in January of 2020, when do you think you're going to see a police station burning down? I would have said maybe 2030, maybe 2035, right? But then by half a year later, you know, we're seeing these things that we never would have imagined. So we are seeing, you know, by the people coming out, by the people becoming more and more conscious of their exploitation, of their oppression, and how that connects to the exploitation and oppression of people in other countries. We're seeing things that we never would have thought were possible only a few months, a few years ago. So
Hey, Vicky.
Sorry?
Vicky, will you come down for a minute and help me get the sound?
Okay, well, I guess that is my cue to wrap up anyway.
That doesn't do any good in here.
Hi, David. I can hear you, but I can't hear.
About the worst of times and the best of times, because on one hand, there's a proxy war in Europe, there's a rising Cold War in Asia, there's a genocidal war in the Middle East. The U.S. is up to their elbows in all of it, and that's horrible. On the other hand, the resistance, as you said, in 10 months, the narrative about Israel and U.S. role with Israel will change. That's because of the Palestinian people, it's because of the team, it's because of the sectors, it's because of all the organizing that needs to be done. So I think we have to kind of say, best of times, worst of times. Political repression, police violence continues apace. At the same time, when we have the biggest rising against racial oppression ever we've ever had in this country. So we have to kind of not see it in a one-sided way. And again, people say to me, well, you know, 68, that was an historic moment. We're living in a historic moment. And the idea that we would be nostalgic is a little bit insane.
Hello, hello.
Hey, hard to hear you guys.
Hey, so the sound seems to be coming in really strong, and then the mics are reverbing. So I just want to check with somebody about that. I fear the moment someone says something loud and it hits the mic, and we're all like in pain.
Hi, everyone. So sorry I can't be there. And it's a little hard to hear you, but I think I got it. Okay. Laura Whitehorn, she, her pronouns. I work at an organization that I helped found along with our dear departed comrades Mujahid Fareed and Kathy Boudin and our friend, the attorney Sophia Elijah. So David is very much part of RAP. And what am I supposed to talk about? Oh, God. Yeah, I know. When I saw that question, I started thinking, and I thought this could be if David and I do this, although he spent 40 years in prison. I only spent 15 years. So my gap is less than his. We could be here all day naming the things. But I started with the SNCC, with Friends of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. To doing what I thought was fighting racism as a white person. Then I was moved by the Black Panther Party to understand that it was a struggle for power. I was part of the anti-war movement. I was part of the lesbian uh, women's movement of the anti-war movement. One of the things we did was take over a Harvard building and hold, none of us was a student at Harvard, but we found a Harvard building. We figured, okay, there are a bunch of war researchers, let's get them. Held it for 11 days. So occupation. Let's see, I worked on the Attica Rebellion was a big moment in my life because it was another rebellion. And I was part of the support for that, and that brought us closer to working with the indigenous movement because of the indigenous incarcerated men who were charged with murder from the Attica Rebellion. I worked on the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee for years and the Madam Bidden Graphics Collective. If Mary Patton is in the audience, she was another member of the Madam Bidden Graphics Collective. The John Brown Anti-Klan Committee came out of what Malcolm said about if white people want to help fight racism, let them do what John Brown did. And then we actually tried to do that later. I worked on the cases of political prisoners for years and was an abolitionist early on, did work in solidarity with Palestine for years in prison, like David and Kathy and others. I did AIDS education and advocacy and support. And I was particularly involved with fighting against the counterintelligence program under the leadership of Mutulu Shakur and Afeni Shakur, both sadly passed now, who had something called the National Task Force for COINTELPRO Litigation and Research. And again, they told us, when the government kills and does dirty tricks against Black people, everyone just shrugs. That's par for the course. But if you show the cases that they did against you as part of the Weather Underground, which I was also in, then we can get attention. So that's what we did. And then after prison, I came out and I was determined to help get out the other political prisoners. And early on, Eddie Ellis, who's also passed, who was a Black Panther and incarcerated in New York State for more than 20 years, said to me and other people, if you keep talking about political prisoners, that's great. You'll build a movement around political prisoners, but they're not going to get out. You have to put them in the category of older people in prison and the people who've served these long sentences. And so, a few years, it took me a while to get, I'm a slow learner, but after a while we got it, and we did start releasing aging people in prison. And I am happy to say that it was a successful strategy and continues to be as we're trying to abolish the prison system. And I'm very active in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and was really honored to go on a trip to Palestine in 2016.
Yeah, one of the benefits of getting out from prison is I've been able to go on free Palestine demonstrations. And that's been exciting, and to see the youth and the spirit and the energy, even like while we don't forget for a minute the unspeakable genocide that's going on. I'm not doing much organizational work. I have a historic relationship to RAP and Laura. Not doing much organizational work now, which I regret, but I'm putting myself in a better position to be able to do that. Historically, to try to be brief, like Laura, I was inspired by civil rights and then by the Panthers and by Vietnam and the range of national liberation struggles going on throughout the global South. And as the movement developed, I also had a lot to learn from women's liberation movement. So in the 60s, I was in civil rights. Starting in 1960, I was in anti-war. I joined Students for a Democratic Society as an anti-imperialist. In the 70s, I was with the Weather Underground for most of that decade. In the 80s, I was working in solidarity with the unit of the Black Liberation Army. One armed action tragically went awry with many tragic consequences. But I went into prison in 81 and did 40 years. But even in prison, you can continue to be an organizer. And I did a lot of work around AIDS in prison. I did a lot of work around prisoners' rights and challenging the prison system as a whole.
Hi, my name is Aislinn Pulley, and I am currently serving as the executive director of the Chicago Torture Justice Center. And we were born out of the 2015 reparations ordinance for survivors of Chicago police torture, which came out of basically a 40-year movement to expose the torture that was occurring and continues to occur in a different manifestation now. But that was largely led by the former CPD commander, John Burge, who was in the Vietnam War and in Vietnam used torture techniques on the population there. He then brought those techniques back to Chicago in about 1970, about a year and a half after the assassination of Chairman Fred and Deputy Mark Clark, and joined the force. He quickly rose within the ranks, largely because of his ability to close cases. What started coming out was that he was using torture techniques, and survivors immediately began attempting to get out these stories, but they were suppressed. suppressed in terms of the attorneys that they were reaching out to, judges, and on and on and on. The earliest case that we know is from 1972, so almost immediately after he was hired. Fast forward to the early 90s, there had been at least a trickle of cases that had gained public attention, and a few people had been released from prison as a result. Gregory Banks was the first one who was released. And that allowed other people then to cite Greg's case in their court cases as evidence that torture indeed did happen. And then by the time the early 90s came, there was enough evidence that there was pressure to force him to be fired by the city of Chicago, and John Burge was finally fired. And this is now 20 years after he joined the force. However, torture didn't stop. He trained tons and tons of other police officers. Some of them were known as the Midnight Crew. Other crews had different names, but they tortured primarily and predominantly Black people, but not exclusively. They also tortured Latinx people and white people all across the city, but primarily on the south sides and the west sides. And these people continued torturing. And in total, John Burge, a very conservative estimate, is that he tortured about 120 primarily Black people. That's the number that the city agreed to. So after he was fired in the early 90s, more and more cases started coming to light. And in the early 2000s, civil rights attorney Stan Willis went to the United Nations to petition to try to get some international attention on what was happening. And the United Nations Committee Against Torture agreed that reparations was owed to people in Chicago and that the city of Chicago owed reparations. We were then able to use that to advance the movement. And at that time, one of the major calls was to try John Burge. He was eventually tried for obstruction of justice and perjury. The statute of limitations had expired on torture. So he was tried by the federal government and then found guilty and sentenced. He ended up doing 4 years. The community at that point, this is the mid 2010s, the community at that point felt like it was a slap in the face. It was not something that was going to restore people based on the harm that was committed. It wasn't going to restore families, restore communities. It wasn't going to free people. And so the community gathered and came together to reimagine what could reparations look like beyond the carceral system, beyond the limits of the carceral system. And an exhibit was put on, and that exhibit called for submissions. One of the people who submitted a piece of art was Joey Mogul with the People's Law Office. And Joey is an attorney and was working on many of these cases for decades at this point, and submitted an ordinance inspired largely by Stan Willis. And the ordinance was a reparations ordinance. And survivors and communities said, let's make this real. And so we actually got city council people to introduce it. And then it was quickly went into the rules committee, assumed dead. This is about 2013. And then, or 2012, and then 2014 runs around. And that year, CPD killed about 20 people. One of the people they killed was a young man named Dominique Franklin on May 20th. And he was tased to death by CPD. And this is why some of the movement demands at that time were about use tasers, not guns. Well, he was tased to death. The community gathered around his death, and we formed We Charge Genocide. And then later that year in August, Ferguson happened. And now we're, now at the 10-year anniversary of Ferguson. And so what was happening was a seismic shift in consciousness and awareness regarding the systemic reality of police violence and police murder and killing. And We Charge then decided at the point where our mayor at the time, Rahm Emanuel, was forced into a runoff election for the first time in 50 years. Let's use this opportunity of his political weakness to really galvanize support. And so we did a 6-month targeted campaign, heavy actions. We took over public transit. We did mock ballots. We created a curriculum that we offered online for free and asked people to hold their own teach Burge, like teach-ins with family and friends. And we did rallies, we did a whole plethora of things. It was very, very, very action heavy, and we were successful. And this is on the aftermath of Ferguson. This is on, during this politically right political moment. And we were successful. Rahm Emanuel brought the ordinance out of committee and put it up for vote, and it passed unanimously. And that then created the first reparations ordinance of its kind in the country. It also created, unbeknownst to us, none of us that I'm aware of realized what we were doing, but we also created the first center dedicated to domestic torture in the country. And that's where I work now, the Chicago Torture Justice Center. There are about 16 torture centers in the country, but they're restricted through their grants funding federally to only treat international torture survivors. I didn't know that at the time. I don't think we knew that as a movement, but because of the movement, we thereby were able to subvert this restriction and become the first. We should not be the first, and we should not be the only. There should be many, many, many torture centers, or many centers in the country that can address and treat domestic torture, because John Burge was not an anomaly. Despite the city's attempts to paint him as this one bad apple, we know that it's systemic. He was able to rise and be promoted as a part of the larger strategy of the rise of mass incarceration, the war on drugs, the war on the poor, the war on gangs, which is, all kind of synonymous. And so now we exist. We're on 63rd and Woodlawn. If you're visiting Chicago for the first time, feel free to stop by and check it out. There are still people incarcerated that we are working really hard to try to free. We work with all the folks who are physically present here on the panel with Kobi and Dixon and Bill. And it's going to take all of us to really tear down this system. We are dedicated to dismantling mass incarceration, certainly, but the carceral system as a whole, which is beyond just prisons. It includes the policing, it includes surveillance. And so that's my intro.
So we have 3 experienced and dedicated organizer activists virtually. We have Colby and Dixon up here. The hybrid model and Zoom in general makes it hard to have a conversation, and yet that was our goal. We want to have a conversation, so we want you to interrupt one another. The Zoom is more given to kind of webinars and giving speeches, but we really want to have a conversation. And the conversation we want to have is about naming this political moment, how you see it, and what are some of the themes, contradictions, challenges, and opportunities, both based on your history, the 5 of you, but also based on how you see where we are now. Because the big question that's looming is, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And that's kind of the question we want to ask. So let me turn to you, to those of you who are coming in virtually, and say, talk a bit about this political moment and what some of the contradictions are that you think are themes that go back a long ways, or things that you think are unique. And feel free to interrupt one another and have a conversation with each other, even though I recognize that it's harder. If we were sitting next to each other, we could elbow each other. But why don't you start, Laura? Naming this political moment, talking about some of the contradictions and themes.
I've been talking with friends about this. I think it's community when you give that choice, chaos, or community, but chaos is also going on in part of it. But, I was on a Zoom educational with Wissam Rafidi. He was speaking. I wasn't with him. He's in Palestine a few weeks ago. And while he was talking, about Axis Storm, which is the name that the resistance gives to October 7th. And, here we're very, especially those of us who work with groups like JVP, I work with them. I also work with Palestinian Youth Movement, a bunch. But we're used to looking at and being very upset and depressed by the level of brutality and suffering that's going on. It's almost unbearable. It's like for people, I don't know, David, if you feel this too, but for people like me, who I was born in 1945, so who grew up in the shadow of the, concentration camps, it was sort of like, okay, this, UN is created, we're not going to do this again. And of course, there have been many genocides since then, but this one on television all the time. So it's very easy to become, and then, watching Trump, and it's very easy to become discouraged. But when Wissam was talking about Axis Storm, it just all of a sudden I thought of the Tet Offensive during the war in Vietnam, which shocked the world, shocked the US. It wasn't a military victory, right? But it was a total political victory in 1968, and it was the beginning of the end for US imperialism trying to, destroy the people of Vietnam, which had looked to us so powerful. It was like our chants were all, the people's spirit is greater than the man's technology and stuff like that, but we saw the man's technology more than we saw. So it's to me, that's a lesson. And in the time, and David and I have talked about this a lot. I mean, full disclosure, we talk to each other. So we don't always agree, but we agree a lot. And what you said, David, about the uprisings in the global South, Africa, Asia, Latin America, the anti-colonial struggles that were coming to fruition in our, in that era, the strategy of too many Vietnams, create too many Vietnams. I see that strategy again when I listen to the organizers from the Palestinian movement. I don't know if others were in Detroit at the big conference in the end of March, who talked about creating disruption to the US war machine and the US capitalist machine. And so I see a lot of parallels, even though we're in a very different historical period. There was the Bandung conference before Vietnam, which was the non-aligned nations and unity among the anti-imperialist forces. And we are seeing some of that kind of thing happening again. So I think it's I hear it all the time. We do a vigil every Monday in my neighborhood, which is actually pretty amazing because we are not a radical neighborhood. And it's an yeshiva university, and a lot of Zionist entities are up here. And I hear all the time this other thing that people say, the people my age get up and speak, and they say, the anti-war movement against Vietnam won the war in Vietnam. And I say, I see David laughing because we had unity on this. No, actually, it was the Vietnamese people who won the war against the United States. So there are certain political essential points that I feel as if are really important in this moment. I mean, the movement now is more sophisticated and more, more feminist, more less racist, more just so many good things that our movement wasn't. So that's why I say community. This movement understands community in a way that we didn't. There aren't a few leaders who speak for the movement. It's more general. So I actually think that is the moment we're in. While it is painful and awful and depressing, it is also full of hope.
Yeah, I think the one of the things I'm thinking about as you were talking is around this idea of, like, I think the thing that I'm thinking a lot about in this moment is the idea of like structure and like rigor in terms of like how we are going about actually organizing enough people, having enough conversations, and like bringing enough folks in to understand one, how long, right, the trajectory is of this fight is for us, but also the contradictions and things that I think folks who are here in this room are like organizing understand, but that the folks who are walking into, you know, our marches or our offices or who we're meeting on the street don't really know, right? Like I think for me, this last year has been, the last 4 or 5 years in general, has been a moment where I think there is a greater connection. I think you were saying it, right? Like a more sophistication in terms of like inclusiveness and stuff. But I think that in addition to that, there's like a real need for us to like really work with folks backwards from like where we ultimately do want to go with folks, right? Like we don't want, I think, you know, me and Aislinn have talked about this, right? Like I don't want 60,000 people in Woodlawn and South Shore to like really understand, right, like why housing should be free and like have no understanding of like Palestine or like no understanding of like why the police are bad, right? And so, or like need to be abolished, right? And so I think like working in solidarity with folks, but also like being really clear with our leaders, like how all these different things connect, right, is key. And then being honest about like what does it take for us to actually like achieve said goals that we're looking for, whether they're like local, national, or international. I think that I'm always very honored to like hear from folks who have organized before us, like taking action, taking risk, those who lived to tell about it, those who didn't, right? Like you read their writings, but it's important for us to like study and understand the history of what we've been doing, but also like be grounded in the fact like these are like data points and like the other pieces we have to figure out, and like that requires like actual practice, right? Like we can't like, you know, I could read Bill's books a million times, but it's like, you know what I mean? Like I gotta then have to go out and talk to someone and like be in organization and be in community with each other. And I think like this moment, folks are getting closer and closer, I think, to feeling pushed to the point where we are being more, I think, direct, but also more like critical and rigorous about where we're trying to go, right? And I think for me, that's like, that's the hopeful part, right? That's the community part, right? Like these structures that we live in like don't work. They don't work if you know, are arriving in Chicago on a bus, right? From Texas, you just cross the border from Venezuela. They're not working if your family's been in Chicago for 60 years and you live on the south side or the west side. They're not working for you if you're white and you live in like most white folks, right? And like Andersonville or like, you know, like wherever you're at, right? Like these things actually don't work. And so the more and more we like go through the cycles of like testing stuff out and seeing why it doesn't work, we get closer to accepting the fact that like we're gonna have to create a thing that there's always gonna be some chaos, right? But like everyone has food, everyone gets fed, no one gets murdered, right? Like massacres. So I think like that's the part that's important for me in this moment, right? Like how do we not repeat 2020 where folks like catch the lingos and slogans, but then we get like co-opted into this thing, and how we get folks to really see the core contradictions of what's going on around all these issues we face, right? And like what's going on this week, right? The DNC is like a really important moment for like, I think, political folks, where this is like a capstone or like it is the Super Bowl of like, you know, American, you know, like, well, the Super Bowl is the Super Bowl, but you know what I'm saying? But like, it is the Super Bowl of like American political like ideology and commentary, right? Like the clips and slogans and things that come out of this are gonna resonate for the next 4 years unless we are like actively organizing against it, right? And so I think like us being clear about that, us having conscious about that is like that's something I'm thinking about a lot in this moment.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please, Kobi.
So, you know, I 100% agree. And, you know, Dixon, when you said, like, these systems are not working, when you said for us, you know, they're not working for us, that's the most important part, I think. Because, you know, like, you can only make a mistake so many times, right? Like, if somebody's been making the same mistake for 400 years, at some point, it's like, well, you're doing this shit on purpose. You know, so like when someone is exploiting and is oppressing and is repressing people for centuries, like there's a method to it, right? Like there's a reason that they do it. So it's not just like, a broken system. It's a system that is doing what it was designed to do, which is create poverty on one end and wealth on the other. So the system is working for Elon Musk, right? It's working for Bill Gates. It's not working for anybody in this room. And I think kind of what educates people about, when into that. Well, let me back up for a second. I think that's why events like this are so important. That's why protesting is so important. All those books, that's why that's so important, to educate ourselves, educate each other, to go out into your community and talk to people and, help people understand how their individual issues are connected to systemic issues, right? Like if somebody is, for example, like they're facing an eviction, that's how they see, okay, the police, who are allegedly supposed to serve and protect, they're the ones who are throwing my shit out onto the sidewalk, right? They go and they try to hold those police accountable for violating their rights. They see the judges are also in on the situation, right? The prosecutors, the prisons, the whole system is guilty. And then, you take it a step further, you look on the news and you see, oh, well, my tax dollars, instead of going to supporting housing, are going to committing genocide, right? So, like the more you work, the more you fight against the people who are actually controlling the system, the more you realize that the system needs to be completely overthrown, and we need to build, like, those of us in here, those of us who are working class, those of us who are oppressed, we need to be the ones who rebuild something that actually works for us.
I want to invite Aislinn and David to say something, and then I've got a bunch of questions from what's been said so far. Aislinn, do you want to add to this conversation?
Sure. I'll also just say quickly that I founded the Chicago chapter of BLM as a result of taking about 20, 30 young folks to Ferguson during the uprising. And so I say that to also mention that I was not, and the chapter was not prepared for 2020. I'm a child of organizers. And so part of the excitement of seeing Ferguson and the uprising was seeing these theories and these things that I had read about in history happening before my eyes. And so I knew that it was a really important historical moment, that something really important was happening and moving. And some of what I'm still processing post 2020 is how do we create organizations that can contain and withstand massive upheaval without imploding? How do we create the infrastructure necessary that reflects our political values, that is aligned and that is able to be malleable enough to then work when it's just a handful of people who are kind of the core leading stuff, to when you have over 200 people joining? Because at our height, we had over 200 people joining, and then we put a pause on membership because we were trying to figure out, how do we vet people? How do we get people in? But for most of the years, there was just a handful of us who really held the work. So I have, since 2020, I'm still learning and reflecting. And, I think there's a lot of things about the movement that, that are, I think, political contradictions that exist. There's also, of course, the role of the state and the ever-present, coercive power of all the shit that they do, both overtly and covertly, which are important, right? But particularly important in this particular type of organizing work. But even with that said, there's such a, I was surprised when Laura said there is a maturation, because I always felt like we're not mature enough, as in, like, politically mature enough in the movement, because we don't agree on so many things in terms of what we're trying to create. We agree on police killing folks is bad. That should end. Mass incarceration should end. Capitalism needs to end. Some of us also make a leap and are wrestling with imperialism. But what are we fighting to do? And not that there's a simple answer, because there isn't a simple answer, but I think that gray area then leaves room for a lot of work that we need to intellectually argue and test with and experiment with intention. And what does it mean then to, and we had these arguments around CPAC and around community control of the police. And I think in Chicago, we were able to enter a conversation around that advanced the discourse in a really important way, because we're oftentimes arguing these theoretical points, right? About, like, theoretical based on our current reality in the United States, on post-capitalism. But we need to really, I think, deepen and offer more experiences and more opportunities to really test our theories and test our arguments, and really be open to fail. Because that's how you learn. Like with anything, in science, you have to test the hypothesis, and then you learn more, you get more knowledge. So I would love us to be able to, one of the biggest contradictions I see is in our ideological contradictions amongst the movement, both stated and kind of implicitly implied, and wanting us to be able to move that forward, because we absolutely can overthrow, dismantle mass incarceration and US capitalism as an imperial project. That is completely possible. We know historically that's possible. This is a very young empire, and all empires fall. What are we working to create? And how are we then working within movement to, create those, create the opportunity to imagine deeper beyond what we're told is possible under capitalism as we understand it today. And so that's where I feel that we haven't matured enough. I'd love us to be able to, with rigor and with generosity, and grace, be able to experiment and test these theories, and then learn in real time, instead of kind of one of the, I think, most difficult things is seeing some of these older organizations just become ossified, and this is the time to experiment.
Yeah, I want to start with a salute to this generation of activists, or better yet, an embrace, because I think people have been amazing. The George Floyd uprisings and the response to the horror of the genocide in Gaza, and tremendous energy and spirit. And to pick up on what Laura said, I think compared to the 60s or 70s, this, at least within the predominantly white left of the time, it was all male dominated, very macho, very arrogant. And I think women's leadership and people of color's leadership and Palestinian and Arab leadership, I don't want to downplay that there are internal tensions and problems and issues, I'm sure there are, but I think there's been a better spirit of community and building and listening to each other and working through issues. So I want to embrace that and acknowledge that. At the same time, let's also acknowledge that this is a very, very dangerous moment. Throughout the history of capitalism, imperialism, people have been genocided, people have been starved and beaten and jailed. We additionally now have the danger of nuclear war as NATO relentlessly pursues its proxy war in the Ukraine. We have the danger of collapse, not only of global warming, but of several key ecosystems. So the threats are existential. And it's what does that mean? It doesn't mean, it really means what everybody's been saying, but I want to emphasize that's the situation. And that makes the work we do even more crucial than it always was, and even more urgent. And we have to learn to feel that urgency and that passion without arrogance towards people who don't understand it yet. Because we have to organize. When people look back at the 60s, they look back at the inflection points, the Columbia strike, but there were years of in-depth, consistent organizing that built the basis for that. And I know that the years of work of the Palestinian pro-Free Palestine movement that preceded this situation, and it's part of why the situation could take off. But that would be the main. Well, the one other thing I want to emphasize is when we look at all the horrors of the current system, and there are a lot that don't get any attention, like the economic sanctions on 40 countries, mainly in the global south, the structural adjustment programs that enforce horrible economic conditions, as well as the internal subversion and the military and the coups. As horrible as that all is, it's done to enforce an economic system where 6 billion people in this world live in poverty, and where 5 million children under the age of 5 die every year from easily preventable causes. So that's the nature of the system. The flip side of that, as Malcolm X taught, and the reason they went after him, is we're part of a global majority. And the people power is what's ultimately, especially when Malcolm highlighted the connection between national liberation struggles within the US, Black liberation, indigenous, Latino, and the vast majority in the global South. How in this time of chaos and destruction, how to channel that and feel connected to it and build it is a major question. But I just wanted to frame the danger of the period and also the potential we have, as the vast majority of people in the world have a tremendous interest in the type of change you were talking about, Aislinn.
Welcome, Jaleel. We're talking about contradictions, where we're going from here. I mean, I think that one of the things several people have hit on is that you can't build a movement without changing the narrative. And in some ways, what's happened in 10 months of genocide in Gaza is the narrative about Israel as a peaceful, democratic country in the Middle East has been ripped asunder. I think Aislinn raises an important question. What is our North Star? What is it we're trying to fight toward? How do we name it? How do we organize people in real time on real issues, and at the same time never give up what the vision we have of a new society? But one question that I have that I keep coming back to is, why is the DNC an important place to demonstrate? Is it an important place to demonstrate? If it is, why?
Can I?
If I can, excuse me for my tardiness in getting on. I had a prior engagement. Nonetheless, I just like to chime into something that my dear comrade David stated in regards to our overall struggle. And the question that you asked is, where do we go? Where's our North Star and where we're going from here? And given the dire conditions from which we are organizing and this kind of apathy that we have going across the country, there's some glimmer of hope in terms of what we're trying to organize, particularly in regards to creating alternative systems of governing and why that is necessary, and the decolonization programs and why that is essential. Trying to get people to recognize that this set of corporate government, this entity, is declining, right? And ultimately, we're going to have the broad effect of it, the brunt of the effect of its decline, and particularly the Black, brown, and indigenous people in this country. Uh, we're going to suffer. And so what we have to do is try to create or envision what it would look like without having to have to be dependent upon this entity for your survival, right? That's what we're calling for the People's Senate. After the 2021 tribunal, where International Tribunal found the United States guilty of genocide against Black, brown, indigenous people, right? A historic event and declaration by the esteemed body of international tribunals. And so for that understanding, it is imperative that we, people of color particularly, remove ourselves from a system that's based upon this idea of white supremacy, right? And that capitalist exploitation of particularly poor people. The same people they brought here and changed are the same people will continue to be the least to have the any equitable distribution of wealth or growth. In fact, you'll find that if you look at our statistics in terms of the growth of Black population in this country, it is not growing. All right? And so we have some serious issues that we have to address in this country. And the way that we do so in the way that we are suggesting or arguing towards is building what we call the People's Senate. All right? And begin to find means where we have some commonality or struggle on the national level, right? Essentially, almost like when we consider a national front, right? We have to really consider creating alternative systems of governing.
Jalil, would you introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your history, very short, and what you're up to now?
Yeah, Jalil Mutakim, veteran member of the Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Army. I spent nearly 50 years in prison, 49 plus months in prison for my activities in regards to the Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Army. While inside, I established the first national newspaper of prisoners called Armed Spirit. Established the first opportunity from which a petition was submitted to the United Nations in regards to prisoners and positions of political prisoners in the United States. I organized and established, along with my comrade, dear sister Sophia Asa Bukhari and Barbara Herman Ferguson. In 1998, we established the National Jericho Movement that still exists today in terms of building support for political prisoners in this country. And in 2018, I inspired myself and comrades aspired to have the International Tribunal for the United States and bring the charges of genocide against the United States. And also I'm an author. I got 2 books written. We Are Liberators and also Escaping the Prison, Fade to Black. So now we're just working to try to survive the best we possibly can on all levels of work and development, trying to provide services to our communities, various organizations that we work with, including Spirit of Mandela Coalition, National Jericho Movement, our dear comrade, Laura Whitehorn and RAP, and this little organization I work with, Citizen Action, and various other organizations that we have, particularly in the state of New York, are trying to mitigate against the conditions of poverty that exist across this country, particularly here in Rochester, the 3rd worst city of poverty in the entire country. And it's horrendous what's going on here in this city. And we're trying to organize as best we possibly can ways to mitigate against the level of poverty that exists in the city. And building decolonization programs is part of that process. So,
Okay.
thank you.